Hey everybody, welcome to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. Today is the first in a series of a few podcasts that will feature guests that have been on this season and where are they now. Today's guest was featured on episode 2, Living Beyond the Wreckage. Her episode resonated with many, so if you get a chance, go back and listen to season 2, episode 2, and listen to that episode. Today I have asked her to come back and share how sharing her story for the first time in this medium was for her. Additionally, Lindsay's story of trauma continued, and I asked her here to discuss PTSD as it pertains to medical issues. So it is my pleasure to welcome back my friend Lindsay Tozer to the podcast. Lindsay, welcome back.
Hey, Amy, how are you doing?
I am doing well. You know, we got to talk football. Your Indianapolis Colts might be in trouble since my Jags got Trevor Lawrence.
Yes, I think so. It's going to be an interesting season all around.
Yeah, but anybody can mess it up. It's the Jacksonville Jaguars, and so. Yeah, for those of you listening out there, you know I'm a huge football fan, and Lindsay is from the greater Chicagoland area and a Colts fan, which is. Let's just say there are worse teams to be a fan of. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for coming back. I know that the episode that we did, Living Beyond the Wreckage, was quite the journey for you, as it was for me. And it is still the most listened to episode that are not solo episodes with the Wednesdays with Watson podcast.
That blows my mind still. I can't. It's a lot to process that, when you just kind of say, hey, just want to let you know. And I'm like, wow, it's hard to wrap my head around that. It really is.
About the people that reached out to us and said, can you connect me with Lee? Because I too, and I don't want to ruin it for those who haven't listened to the episode, Living Beyond the Wreckage, but I too have lived through that. I shared that with you, and that's a little bit of the pleasure that I've gotten from this podcast is that they do resonate with people. So let's jump right into it. Tell me, how was it for you to tell your story? Because I had heard bits and pieces of it just because I'm your friend. I had heard, but I had never heard it in its entirety. So I know how it was from my side of the microphone. But I think it probably was one of the first times that you told that story in a public medium in its entirety. Is that correct? First of all, let me not assume that.
From at the conclude for the whole start to finish, yes. I had shared briefly, what I could of the story when I was for the Great Banquet, when I went through the Great Banquet in Indianapolis, which, is still at the very beginning onset of going through all of this. So by the time that I came around to sharing my story with you, yes, it was the first time that I have in 20 years really shared it publicly with the masses, if you will.
You told me something after we got off of that Zoom call that John, who is your significant other, was waiting in the kitchen and you just literally fell into his arms.
I did. Yeah, it was, I didn't even tear up now, remembering that moment because it was a release, I think is the best word really to describe it. I've been holding it in for so many years, and to be able to have a candid conversation with you about this, knowing the people and the lives that were could be, touched and moved and have some type of, aha moment in their life, if you will, from hearing that they're not alone, was huge for me. And I'm not the type of person who wants to ever make it about me. It's not about me at all. And I'm constantly putting other people first. And so having that opportunity, with your help and your assistance and your guidance and your microphone, really was a release for me. And so in that moment, it was kind of like, there's no turning back. And the doors of endless possibilities for helping others have just continued to open one door after another. And it's because of this podcast and the work that you are doing in the world, because I know it's anybody can Google search a podcast, that the difference that it's making in people's lives, whether it's the entire story, it's a piece of it, it resonates and it hits home. There's something about the message that hits home with everybody. And to be able to finally have the opportunity to speak that, I just felt this huge sigh, internally, externally, and it was overwhelming all over again.
To me, because it is the most listened to episode that's not a solo episode. I actually got contacted, and again, I don't want to spoiler alert if you've not listened to the episode, but I got contacted by the organization, the Cause of Accidental Death and Injury. And they were a big reason, I think, why this episode is so heavily listened to. In addition to, and this is my next question for you, is what was the most common response that you got from your friends and family after the episode dropped?
I am so proud of you. I heard, and I still hear that over and over and over again, and not just verbally to me, but in text messages, when it was shared out on their social media pages. Just, I am so proud of you. And for something that happened to me and everyone else in this situation, it's, to use the word proud, was, you always think of it as like, I'm proud of you, did a great job on the ball field today. I'm proud of you for your new job position or your promotion. But to hear somebody say, and everybody say, I'm proud of you for doing this, it really took it, it elevated it to the next level. And it was almost like it gave me permission to do more and continue sharing my story, and to continue sharing my healing and my struggles, and the struggles that I can still continue with today. And having other avenues to talk about this just continues to further the healing even more.
Well, as I said on a podcast interview that I did, actually the one that dropped this past Wednesday, called Witnessing a Near-Death Experience, was also another friend of mine. And I tell you the same thing I told her: you are my why. And I am proud of you too. And I told you that many, many times. And of course, checked in with you lots afterwards. But one of the reasons why, in addition to that, because there is just power in telling our story, but there is a time when we have to keep that story to ourselves, and it has to heal. But I was so proud of you that day, because you were very able to articulate a very difficult situation. And I wanted to be careful with the story too, because it is not an easy one to listen to. And so I am also proud of you. And so I wanted to ask you those two questions for the where are they now part of the interview, but you also unfortunately meet the criteria of something else that I wanted to cover on the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. We are recording this in May of 2021, and this episode will also drop in the last Wednesday of this month of May of 2021. This is Mental Health Awareness Month, and there are many, many different mental illnesses that we could address out there. However, mine is on PTSD. And so again, to not spoiler alert on the episode that you were on, but you were involved in an accident 20 years ago. What was the first significant medical issue you had after that accident? And again, we want to be careful for spoiler alerts. So this interview is interesting. So what was the first significant medical issue you had after the accident?
So going beyond the mental health and the weight issues that I've struggled with my entire life, but still play a part of my story, I was officially diagnosed with PCOS, which stands for polycystic ovarian syndrome, in 2004. PCS, for those of you who aren't aware, it's a serious genetic, hormone, metabolic, and reproductive disorder that affects women. It's also the leading cause of female infertility. and can lead to lifelong complications and other serious conditions, including severe anxiety, depression, obesity, and other things like that. It's been classified as a complex hormonal, metabolic, and reproductive disorder that usually is diagnosed in women around childbearing age. And so because it's been proven to be a familial condition, it's not something that just randomly happened, but it's also something that has never, was never tested for, was never, no other family members had it. And so when I was diagnosed with this, I, on one hand, wanted to shout out to everybody who had made fun of me because of my weight and things like that, and say there is a reason, there is a medical reason that defines this. But then the other side of me, I felt like I was being punished. I felt like it was you had this accident and now you're never going to be able to have children.
Mm.
And so that led into.
Let's stop just for a second there.
Sure.
Gosh, you really almost have to listen to your first episode to realize that was a powerful, powerful statement.
Yeah.
So this was about 3 years after the accident.
Yes, ma'am.
That you were diagnosed with this. And what's interesting to me about that is, so in some circles that PCOS is qualified also as an autoimmune disease. Mm-hmm. I find it really interesting that you say that there were no family genetics. And so I want to draw a timeline here, because really something very similar happened to me after I got safe, and I'm air quoting when I say safe, from my trauma, where I was actually diagnosed with 4 autoimmune diseases. Yeah. And so what we're going to talk about during this interview, because we're going to be telling a linear story of what's happened to your body since that event in 2001. So you're diagnosed with PCOS, and that was about 3 years after the accident. And so you began to deal with some of those things, but then now is where the timeline gets a little confusing to me, because I know in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, some significant medical issues have arisen. And so I want you to briefly tell us about those. And then I want to talk about how and if your PTSD has played into how you've walked through some of these very, very, very difficult medical issues. And so you got diagnosed with PCOS about 3 years after the accident. And so that would put us in 2004. We're now in 2021, and we are having a conversation about medical issues with you. So tell me what I want to say. It's about the last 3 to 4 years. Some of the significant things have happened. So tell us the big things so that we can have that conversation.
So the first big thing was I was diagnosed with 3 major tumor issues. The first one is part of the PCOS, which resulted in a full, total, complete hysterectomy. And then 3 weeks later, my left kidney was removed, because at the same time I was diagnosed with kidney cancer, and they called it an angry and aggressive stage 2, almost 3. So the fact that this had been growing in my body for, at that point, when it's almost a stage 3 tumor, he said it was the size of a football, which is pretty big, it had been growing for a long time. And I just never knew, because of everything else with my body.
Been growing for, say, I can't even do that math in my head. Could it have been growing for, say, like 18 years?
Yes, very, very may well have been. Exactly. And same with the tumors from the polycystic ovarian syndrome as well. So that, and then I had on the right side of my body, I had an adrenal gland tumor that was about 5 centimeters. So the following year, I had my right adrenal gland removed. I had a lipoma tumor in the back of my neck that was removed the day after Christmas 2018. And then when I lost 100 pounds, through various, after my kidney cancer, I said, I have to do something drastic. So I completely changed my way of eating and all of those habits and lost 100 pounds. And then it was discovered that I had 6 tumors in my thyroid, both sides of my thyroid gland. So surgery is still pending on those. But there's one of them that is 6 centimeters, and it's hard and it's large and I can feel it, and it's really scary and annoying. Yes. All of the above. So my body appears to respond to stress and trauma with tumors. I had genetic testing done at Moffitt Cancer Center, where I'm a patient, to try and see if there was any genetic reasons for the kidney cancer or anything else, and there's not. So the only response that they're able to give me is that my body responds to stress and trauma with tumors.
And this is, we talked about on that episode about how the body keeps the score, and we only alluded to some of these things, but yes, the body does truly keep the score. And I am also an example of that. I look for autoimmune diseases. And so those things themselves then, right? So you were diagnosed with PTSD in 2000, I can't remember what year it was.
2001, right after the accident.
Right after the accident. And so going through the last several years, because you've been really just amazing about sharing the medical journey, and I love the selfies at Moffitt, but it got scary there for a while. And so as a PTSD patient, and I'm asking you this because this has not been my experience until recently, because as I get more healthy and realize that I actually do want to be on this planet, medical things actually scare me and they trigger me and they really kind of poke my PTSD. But because when we have PTSD, it means that our safety has been compromised at some point.
Yes.
So let's talk about when they went. I mean, taking out a kidney is a big deal.
Yes.
Can you walk us through any of your PTSD PTSD, the way PTSD presented itself, and the buildup and the actual surgery and the recovery and the waiting for the pathology? Because we're really talking about medical PTSD here that we've added on top of an existing significant PTSD. I think you have joined the ranks that I am in with the complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which isn't even in the DSM-5 manual yet, which is so frustrating to me. But I want to talk a little bit about, we know you have PTSD. They tell you we got to take out your kidney.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what that did for you from a PTSD standpoint.
I felt like I was, like I said before, I felt like I was being punished, like I had done something wrong, and that this was my penance, if you will, for everything that has happened in my life previously.
Let's go back to the hysterectomy for a second, because that officially took the opportunity for you to have any children off the table.
Yes,
it did. Guilt and shame came to visit because of that accident?
Oh, absolutely. So absolutely it did. And
I were being punished, basically.
Yes. I felt like I was being punished. I felt like I can't, I was never going to have that. Like, I knew with having PCOS that it was a very low probability that I would ever be able to have children. And this just kind of sealed the fate, if you will. To the point where, the doctor said, even going into the surgery room, he said, there's a 50-50 chance that I may be able to save one ovary. But he said, I'm really not going to know until I get in there, because what I'm seeing on the scans is, is so large and massive. And when he actually got in there, the tumor had grown, the largest tumor, which I don't know why they always talk about fruit, but fruit.
Yep.
It's so weird. Because every time I go to the grocery store, I'm like, oh, there's my ovarian tumor, and there's,
Right.
So the size of a watermelon is what I was carrying around in my lower cavity. And by the time that he got in there, it was around the ovaries. So there was absolutely, he couldn't save anything. And
how have you worked through this?
That is a very complicated question, because I immediately went from that surgery into my kidney surgery 4 weeks later, because my kidney oncologist said, this has to come out now. It can't wait any longer. They were actually talking about doing both the surgeries at the same time, but they were on different parts of the body. So it wasn't able to happen, which was fine. But it was also my very first surgery ever. I'd never had surgery in my life. So it's I don't think I've really ever worked through it totally, because everybody's cancer story is different. And so that drive to Moffitt, when you're coming in, driving up and you're getting out and they're taking your car away and you go in, I'm always thinking about everybody else's cancer story. I was extremely fortunate to not have had to have radiation, no chemotherapy, because everything was all contained. And so I then go through this. It's not fair. Like, my cancer, why it's not fair. and I felt, I remember times immediately after the surgery when people would say, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And I would say, it's not fair. I would say, I don't feel whole. I feel like parts have literally been taken from me. And I don't feel whole, and I don't feel the way that God made me and intended me to be. And I don't feel right. And usually and it shocked people, because I'm the person that my first response when somebody says, how are you doing, is, I'm fine. When in fact, it's so hard to communicate that. But because I always want people to feel okay, and I don't want people to worry about me. So I didn't deal with it as well as I should have.
Okay.
And
hold on, you're my friend and my podcast, and so I get to say something here.
Yeah.
You didn't deal with it as well as you should have. This is the point of doing this podcast. You have PTSD.
Yes.
And so you walked into this situation with our friend's guilt and shame as well. And so here's, this podcast, especially when I have my friends on, has become a little bit preachy, but I'm sorry. I have to, I can't help myself. I have not had cancer. Well, that's not true. I did have a cancer scare, but your reaction and your response to it is so typical of PTSD in my mind, because we think that we are spoiled already, that
right.
the gig is up, that what happened in 2001, and that for me, what happened over a course of 35 years made it so that I could be the one to take the bullet for everybody. I have a really good friend of mine who's been mentioned several times on this podcast. Her name is Cheryl, and she is my pastor's wife down in Clearwater. And she tells a story of back in the day when I was going through, when they were trying to figure out what was wrong with me, and I was getting heart ablations at Tampa General Hospital. And she would ask me, so how are things going with you, Amy? And my standard answer would be, it's all good. It's all good. It's all good. And she's smart alecky enough to pretty much knock me up, give me the, the nonverbal slap upside the head and go, I know it's not all good. And so I just want to encourage you that you are responding to it in the way that you know how to respond to it. You're responding to it based on existing PTSD. And I also want to ask you, do you understand that what you've been through, and I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV, but do you understand that what you just described to us is more PTSD? I don't think medical PTSD is in the DSM-5 either, but what you just described to us, things like them taking a football-sized tumor out of you, a watermelon-sized tumor out of you, and then just a couple of weeks ago, you sent me a text and said, I'm clear for another year. And so when I ask you how you're walking through it, please, I want you to know that you are responding to it in the best way you know how.
Yes.
Okay, so let's stop there just for a second. You're responding to it in the best way you know how. Now, I'm not going to spoil your story, which is on episode 2, and if people haven't gotten that by now, then you're not listening. I don't want to spoil the story, but I also want to speak truth into you, is that we don't serve a punitive God, right?
Oh, I know.
So when you're working through this, I want you to remember that we don't serve a punitive God, and that these health issues that you've been through may be the body keeping the score. It's a story that is being scripted for your life, but you're on my podcast again, talking to people about this massive amount of medical trauma that you've been through. And you're being very, very honest with me about how you have walked through it and what you thought. And even still, as you're still walking through it, I just want to encourage you that this is PTSD. You are the face of PTSD, and guilt and shame love to come to us. And remember, shame meaning shame is I am the mistake, not I made the mistake. Right. So what happened in 2001 was an accident. It was a mistake. And so I just needed to preach to you there for a minute. But let me ask you, as we begin to kind of ebb towards the end of the podcast, did you notice going through any of the medical stuff, particularly because it was your first surgery and you're going under anesthesia for the first time and the hospital for the first time? Did you notice any PTSD symptoms exacerbated as you walked through those processes, like from the accident?
From the accident specifically?
No, just PTSD stuff, period. So floodings, fast heart rate, panic attack.
Oh, yes.
Those things.
Yeah. So like being wheeled into surgery, I had flashbacks of being wheeled into the hospital.
Oh.
Looking up at the ceiling, and then when you're on the operating table and they're getting ready to put you under, and you're kind of going to that weird la la land moment, you hear everybody talking around you, and so that took me back to being in the emergency room at that time, immediately after, and I started, there are visions, because I'm a visual person, so I see a lot in my head.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So a lot of the flashbacks, like I started having more little pieces come back, memories, bits and pieces, moments, stuff like that. Like being in recovery and having everybody, hovered over top of me, trying to bring me out of that. So there's
brought you back to that night in the ER in 2001. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Something really interesting. I had a guest on my podcast, and this may be of great interest to you, and because you just said something really important that might scare some people that are listening to the podcast with PTSD, because sometimes when you begin to deal with PTSD, it does get worse before it gets better. And as you heal, these bits and pieces of the trauma start to come back. And I had this therapist on the podcast who explained to me the way the brain works, that a server at a restaurant, like when we used to do that, a server at a restaurant is more likely to remember an incomplete order than they are a complete order, because our brain wants to finish things. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you and to kind of conjoin this medical trauma that you've been through with what you already went through, because I was curious if telling your story on the podcast like you did, which helped you consolidate the memory, and then also going through that, I wondered if you would begin to start to get some of those memories back. So I almost feel like I need to apologize, but I promise that once I promise you that once you continue to process through that, that as those memories come back, you will begin to deal with the flashbacks and floodings, and better. I hope that you don't end up back in an operating room. I am so
Yeah.
proud. And I do want to say that I'm proud of you for continuing to work through it, and your body is continuing to respond. But on this day in May of 2021, you are healthy. And so
Yes.
I'd just like you to close us out of the podcast by giving someone advice. They're on the other side, they're in their car, they're walking, there's something, and they have been through trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma. Why is God still good?
God is good because he is, and all the time. God is good all the time. He loves us. He gave his son for us. I know he always has me. He's never going to let me go. And I would just encourage, wherever you're listening and wherever you are in your walk of faith, whether you believe or you don't believe, or you have friends that believe and you're not sure, just know that you are loved. Know that there is somebody who, no matter what, is always going to be there for you. If you're not comfortable with how that feels, if it makes you feel uncomfortable, I am sorry. But you are loved and cared for and cherished, and you will always be. And that feeling is something that will always be with you for the rest of your life, no matter how hard you try and push it down.
It's great advice. Great advice. Our hearts are just so in sync. Well, Lindsay, thank you for coming back on the podcast. It's such an honor. I just love talking to you. I am proud of you because I'm watching you. I'm watching healing right in front of you, and you're using your voice and you're using your story and you're speaking from your scars and not your wounds. And I think that's so important. And there are still some wounds, and you're not speaking from those. But I think it's important for our listeners to understand that two things that I wanted them well, three things. First, I wanted them to get an update on you. And two, I wanted us to continue to highlight how the body does keep the score. And then finally, I wanted to hear your experience from the medical trauma and how and if it was connected at all to your original event that led to that diagnosis of PTSD. And so, I love you. And I can imagine that we probably will be back on one of these podcasts again. I do appreciate you saying that to people. And so as we end the podcast, I would like to thank you for your time. As you know, I say it every single time because I believe it's super, super important that time is something that we're not making more of. And so thank you, Lindsay, for being here today. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I just want to let people know, just if you have that gut feeling pulling inside of you that you need to talk to somebody, please talk to somebody. Do not hold it in.
Do not hold it in. And we have those 3 C's: church, trauma-informed counseling, and community. And then, of course, Jesus, who is the star of our story. And so if you're under the sound of my voice, like Lindsay said, even if you don't believe, find something to believe in, whether it's Monday Night Football, like a therapist told me this morning, but know that you are seen, you are known, you are loved, you are heard, and you are valued. And so as Phil Baker's song plays us out of the podcast, it's a song called Marked by You. Lindsay, you are marked by Jesus. And so I just want to thank you so much again for coming. Thank you for your friendship. And please, 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 please come back to the Healing Zone. And for all of you out there listening, we will be back in 2 weeks. And you know what I'm going to say. Let the healing continue.
So that my life glorify